Thank you. I first met Matthew Pinsker in Springfield, Illinois, appropriately enough. And that was where I first heard him talk about his new book on Lincoln and the soldier's home, called Lincoln's Sanctuary. Here's what Publishers Weekly had to say about that book. That most rare of things, a book that actually adds to the Lincoln literature, telling us stories we haven't heard. Other comments on the book: a marvelous book, an uncommonly original look at Lincoln, exhaustively researched, elegantly written. And finally, here's David Herbert Donald's verdict. Pinsker's important and fascinating book tells for the first time the story of Lincoln's summer White House, where so many of the major decisions of the Civil War were made. His research is indefatigable, and Pinsker's findings will be new even to Lincoln specialists. From his essays to his books to his reviews, Dr. Pinsker's work is generous, elegant, smart, sensitive. And when he writes about Lincoln, he shows us how the personal Lincoln and the political Lincoln were intertwined. Students at Dickinson College, where Dr. Pinsker holds the chair in American Civil War history, are surely fortunate to have him. We're most honored to have him here today.
Well, I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank Jennifer for that introduction. It was very nice. Of course, she didn't tell you that the person who said it was a marvelous book was Pinsker's grandmother. And David Donald was praising the book, thinking to himself, well, I taught him. I have to say something about him. But I do appreciate the kind words, and I hope in a room full of Lincoln experts and enthusiasts who are also probably from the immediate area, a discussion about the soldier's home can be interesting and informative. It can also be casual and provocative, and that's what I aim to do today. I wanted to begin with a simple insight, and I hope it's something that seems intuitive. Places matter in our lives. Whether we live in the cities or the suburbs or on a farm, a particular place matters in our life. A home, a childhood home, a summer house, even rooms within a home bring out certain components of our personalities. I think we all know that aspects of our private life in the places where we live can change us. You know, the people we meet there, the people we interact with, whether they're family or friends, they can also bring out aspects of our personality and transform us, make us thoughtful, romantic, combative. And I think that insight is something each of us can hold on to for ourselves. The question I asked in my book, and the question I wanted to talk about a little bit today, is whether that holds true for Lincoln. Whether some aspect of his genius and his accomplishment is rooted in the story of where he lived. We do find in the course of Lincoln's studies there is an appreciation, I think, for his background. From the earliest biographies of Lincoln, there is a sense that the frontier, his childhood in Kentucky and Indiana, later his experience in Illinois, especially in Springfield, matters. You know, when he said, "Here I have lived," as he left Springfield in 1861, there was an emotional resonance there that a lot of scholars and a lot of students have focused upon over the years. But when it comes to his presidency, I think there's been a lot less attention to this idea. And, you know, it was very painfully apparent to Lincoln, I think, early on, that his living quarters, when he arrived in Washington, were not conducive to the kind of person he wanted to be or the needs he had. Several friends, John Hay, Leonard Swett, and others, recall him using the same phrase to describe life in the White House. It's an iron cage. An iron cage is what he found it to be in that first year. And I see in his behavior as president and commander-in-chief not just the anxieties of a rookie in the middle of a very tense period, but also a person who has yet to find his equilibrium in his private life, struggling to get that under control as he faces these enormous public decisions. And so then, in my book, I make an argument that this retreat, this Camp David of the 19th century, the soldier's home, becomes for Lincoln a transformative place where he reestablishes his equilibrium, and that enables him to become a greater public figure. I do that in a variety of ways, and there's a lot of different things we can talk about. But because of the sort of theme of this conference, because of some recent news and other books, I wanted to talk about two things. And they're both provocative, and they're both, in a sense, unknowable. And so I want to, concede that at the outset. One is the Lincoln marriage and what we've learned about it through the Soldiers' Home. And the other is Lincoln's friendships with men and what we've learned about that through the Soldiers' Home. And as I said before, it's partly an unknowable subject, these very private, intimate matters, and yet I will argue today that there is some new evidence and some new insights that we should have learned from re-examining the Lincoln story through this place of the Soldiers' Home. And I do think that they raise some questions for people who've made arguments on one side or the other about the Lincoln marriage, and also, of course, about Lincoln's sexuality. So let me start with the marriage and about the Soldiers' Home. You have to understand the two are intimately connected at the very beginning, because Lincoln would not have gone to the Soldiers' Home but for his wife. Mary Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln both visited the Soldiers' Home, a retreat that James Buchanan had used at the very beginning of his presidency. And they had planned to spend some time out there in the summer of 1861, but the war intruded. And I imagine with Lincoln's workaholic ways, he never would have gone out to the Soldiers' Home. But in the spring of 1862, Mary Lincoln became much more earnest about pushing him to agree to establish this kind of summer White House. And the reason was very private. Their son Willie had died in February. The mourning period was difficult in the White House, and Mary Lincoln in May was in the middle of this very sort of strange dispute with his White House aides, the president's aides, led by John Hay, who were writing her notes, asking her whether or not it was time for the Marine Band to start up its summer concert series. And when she resisted because of the mourning that they were still undertaking for their son, Hay responds in typical insensitive fashion, I would imagine, for him, and especially in his relationship with her, by asking, well, then, if that would be a problem, maybe they could move the band across the street to Lafayette Square. So at this point, she explodes, and she says that it is impossible for them to be imposed upon in this way. And she convinces her husband that despite all of the work and all of the pressures of the war, which had been growing more, not less, since the previous summer, the family needed a sanctuary. And so they decided in June of 1862 to move out 3 miles to a cottage on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, which is a military retirement community. And there, Mary Lincoln writes, almost from the beginning, that they fell in love with the place. In a letter that she wrote just shortly after moving to a friend, she says, "We are truly delighted with this retreat. The drives and walks around here are delightful, and each day brings its visitors. Then, too, our boy Robert is with us, whom you may remember. We consider it a pleasant time for us when his vacations roll around. He is very companionable, and I shall dread when he has to return to Cambridge." The family, together in the aftermath of the death of one of their members, it was an important and eventful time for them. And it's a time, I think, that reflects the influence of Mary Lincoln over Abraham Lincoln's decisions, and also suggests, and there will be several other suggestions over the next 3 seasons when they return to spend time at the Soldiers' Home, that this influence is not always negative, but is in fact very positive at occasions and welcomed in other occasions. And so what I begin to see here in the Soldiers' Home is a story about a marriage that is seeking a refuge from some of its troubles and begins to find some of this refuge from its troubles. In the course of their 13 months together in the Soldiers' Home, from the summer of 62, the summer of 63, and the summer of 64, the Lincolns did things together in this place that they weren't able to do at the White House. First of all, you can imagine the White House is not a home in the usual sense. The staff is large and big and full of strangers. The Soldiers' Home cottage was a place where Mary Lincoln had more control. She had a hand-picked cook and a valet for her husband, and a very small arrangement there that she could manage. They were more intimate. The soldiers who eventually were assigned to guard the family report that every morning Mary Lincoln would wake up and stand in the window and watch as her husband went off riding away to the White House. Some of the soldiers report that there were little scenes of affection between them. When it was cold and they would go in a carriage together from the Soldiers' Home, one of the cavalry officers noted that she would arrange a shawl on his shoulders. And these are all small things. They undertook some activities together. For example, one of their aides, Tom Stackpole, got a letter of endorsement that the two of them signed together, and which Mary Lincoln wrote at the Soldiers' Home. I think, if I'm correct, it's one of the only, if not the only, moment when they actually endorsed a letter together. And these are such small things, but there are a few larger things that I think are equally, if not more meaningful. One of them is very intimate. In fact, probably the most intimate thing of all. One of the soldiers who was assigned to the cottage had a telegram that he had to report to the president late at night, and so he enters the cottage and stumbles upstairs, knocks on the door. The president tells him to come in, and there he discovers, to his horror, the president is in bed with his wife. It shocked his sensibilities. When he told Ida Tarbell about this decades later, when she was interviewing him, he suggested she might not want to report this in her biography, and she excluded it. But I believe, and I may be incorrect here, but I believe this is the only evidence we have of direct testimony putting the president and his wife in bed together, especially during this period. And what's going to be very interesting about this, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes, the person who made this discovery, the witness, was Charles Erickson, whose father was David Erickson, who has a special relationship with the president that we're about to discuss in a few minutes. There is a story, though, and it's complicated. There were also some incidents at the Soldiers' Home which suggest that the affection between the two did not grow exponentially during their time together at this cottage. One of the infantry soldiers who recalled how the president and his wife used to visit their camp and share some coffee and a plate of beans, was the way he put it. He shared a story about how the president, drinking the coffee, remarked in front of his wife, "Why, Mother, this coffee's better than what you give me," which set her off and sent her storming back to the cottage, and the president skulking after her apologetically. And so I see in that the same kind of full-fledged or full-throttle marriage you might see in any relationship in the 19th century. Moments of affection, moments of irritation, periods of distance. Those who believe the Lincoln marriage was troubled can look at the Soldiers' Home story and find some evidence for their claims as well. The best evidence is not any evidence of fighting. Often in the Springfield years, we have neighbors who testify to vicious fights between the two. I haven't found any testimony like that for the White House years, at least from the Soldiers' Home story. But I did find one notable fact, which surprised me, and I think if you believe the Lincoln marriage was troubled, it is evidence in favor of that argument, and it is this. Even though they went to the Soldiers' Home as a refuge for their family, and it was a place for them to reconnect as husband and wife and as family, Mary Lincoln increasingly began to spend time away from the cottage and the Soldiers' Home, leaving the president alone, taking Tad with her, Robert away at school. In fact, out of the 13 months they were there, Mary Lincoln was gone over a third of the time. And so, it would seem strange that a place that was supposed to be their sanctuary, which she said was delightful, is a place she would leave when she would have such rare access to her husband in a way that she never would have at the White House. And I do think that's, an important bit of evidence that we need to consider. But when I looked over all of the evidence, I came up with, at least in my theory, a story. And the story here is about how the Lincolns were trying to grapple with this new world, which was an inversion in many ways of their old world. In Springfield, the president, before he was president, traveled and left Mary at home. Once he's in Washington, he's stuck in the White House, and she's the one who can travel. And that inverts what had once been, their dynamic, where she would throw tantrums to get him to come home and pay attention to her and leave his circuit-riding ways and be a more dutiful husband. Now he's the one stuck in the office at the house, in the White House, and she's traveling to Philadelphia and Boston and New York, and she's frequently away, leaving him isolated. The Soldiers' Home, for them, becomes a place where they can share some private time and then ultimately where they can find some separate space. But there is one moment in all of this story which I see as kind of pivotal, where they reach an accommodation over these competing wants and needs. Essentially, him trying to balance his family concerns with his public responsibilities, and her trying to be a dutiful wife while still demanding his time in the ways that she needed. And that moment for me comes in the summer of 1863. And it's little known, but I think some of you know this. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Mary Lincoln suffered an accident. She was in a carriage accident as she was leaving the soldiers' home to go visit soldiers in a nearby hospital. And at first, they didn't think it was very serious. She had fallen off of the carriage and hurt her head. But then the wounds in her head became infected. And in the week after the Battle of Gettysburg, her situation deteriorated, and there was real concern about her life. Of course, this is a very difficult week for the president. The battle is over, as you know, but he is so intent on capturing Lee's army and so perplexed that General Meade and the Army of the Potomac isn't following through on what he sees as this great opportunity, that he, according to all of his aides and all of the testimony we have, he just won't leave the War Department. He is literally there night and day. Meanwhile, his wife is growing increasingly sicker at the soldiers' home. And you have this fundamental choice now, the president choosing between his public duties and his private concerns. And at this moment, it's interesting what happens. He reaches out to his son. You know, at first, when the accident occurred, he sent Robert a note. Robert was a student at Harvard during this period, but he was on vacation, and he was traveling through the North with his friends. I think at the time it was in New York. And the president sent him a telegram. At first, it said, "Don't be uneasy. Your mother very slightly hurt by her fall." Within a couple of days, though, realizing that the situation was deteriorating and perhaps looking for some help, he says to Robert in another telegram, "Come to Washington." Washington, though, is not the place that Robert Lincoln sees as any sanctuary for himself. Out of all the time they spent together as a family in the soldiers' home, out of all those 13 months, Robert's only there for a few weeks. It's kind of a telling bit of testimony about the father-son relationship there, I think. And here, at this moment, when his mother's hurt, Robert still dallies, at least in his father's opinion, and doesn't come fast enough. And so finally, he sends a telegram to his son in the next couple of days that's more urgent and says, "Why do I hear no more of you?" And then Robert reports that he comes to the White House in the afternoon and finds the president there with his head buried on his desk, literally on the point of tears, saying, "I could have whipped Bobby Lee myself if I had gone up there." And at this moment, you see Lincoln's frustration, his exhaustion, but his determination to go forward. Here's where I think the private accommodation comes in. Mary Lincoln does recover. That's obvious. Although Robert says, by the way, as a footnote, that she was never the same after that. When people talk about her personality and her temperament, he blames a lot of it in the post-war years on that carriage accident. Not very many scholars accept that explanation, but that was an explanation that he pursued. But what happened after she recovered is interesting. Within 2 weeks after the recovery, she takes a trip to the north, goes to Vermont, and she's gone for the longest stretch of time during the entire period of the war. 8 weeks she spends away from her husband. Now, after a serious accident with a major wound and an infection and a crisis over her life, for her to leave so shortly thereafter seems to me to be testimony about something. Either she was upset with him or he wasn't able to help, but there is something there that strikes me as unusual. What happens, though, is interesting. The distance, I think, makes the heart grow a little fonder. As the weeks wear on, the president writes letters reporting updates to his wife about Tad's goat at the soldiers' home, about life in Washington, about the weather, and increasingly the letters grow more affectionate, even more needy. And at the end, they become extremely needy as the president literally begs her to come back. And this, for me, is an important turning point in their relationship where they reach this accommodation. And there's a letter in September that he writes, which is not often quoted, but I think is important, where he says, "The air is so clear and cool and apparently healthy that I would be glad for you to come. Nothing very particular, but I would be glad to see you and Tad." This is what he writes on September 21st. In my opinion, as I was looking at the evidence for my book about the soldiers' home, after the summer of '63, after the crisis of the carriage accident, both in his private life and his personal life, Lincoln becomes more steady, or steadier. He and his wife realize that they need each other, but they also need their space. He, according to his aides, has mastered the office in a way that he had never done before. I don't think it's a coincidence that in that summer when his wife was away, John Hay reports that the president was in fine whack and that he was master of all of the politicians in Washington. And I really don't think it's a coincidence that during this summer, his thinking evolved. You know, in July of '63, Serenade had approached him and asked him to talk about the meaning of Independence Day, and he said, how long ago was it? 80-odd years since the country was created. And then, of course, a few months later in Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, he turns that awkward statement into the powerful 7 years ago, a sentiment that he developed as he was thinking it through over the summer of '63, on his own, admittedly, but thinking through both his marriage and his public duty. And I think in both cases, he found a kind of stable middle ground, an equilibrium, that you see in full force in 1864, the final long year of the war for him, where the president is able to soldier through both good and bad news, stick to an emancipation policy, not just as a proclamation, a military doctrine, but to write it into the platform of the Republican Party and wage a re-election campaign on its basis. A very risky move that he deserves an awful lot of credit for, but that came from, I think, ultimately, a reservoir of confidence that has to be explained in some fashion. And the way I would explain it is to say that he had found this sort of stability in his personal life that made him take public gambles with greater abandon and in a way that reduced his anxiety. Now, there is another element of sustenance that he obtains during his period at the Soldiers' Home that has nothing to do with his wife, but that has everything to do with his friends. And this is what Dr. Tripp has written about in his book about the intimate world of Lincoln. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit because I think it's important. And one of the key pieces of evidence in this new book about the gay Lincoln or the bisexual Lincoln is this figure, David Erickson. And I do think it's worth talking about. David Erickson was a captain in the company of soldiers who guarded the family at the Soldiers' Home. He was about 10 years younger than the president, in his mid-40s. He had been married twice, and his son was in the unit. I mentioned his son earlier because Charles Erickson was the one who had delivered that telegram to the sleeping Lincolns. So in 1862, when David Erickson and the soldiers first arrive to guard the family at the Soldiers' Home, there's a sort of shock wave of gossip that sweeps through Washington. At least that's my supposition. I think it's fair because we see a series of comments in different forms, different bits of evidence that testify to the fact that David Erickson, the captain of this unit, and the president become very fast friends. I found it first in a recollection from one of the members of the regiment writing the regimental history, and he wrote this years after the war, but referring to this period in the fall of '62. He says, Captain Erickson in particular advanced so far in the president's confidence and esteem that in Mrs. Lincoln's absence he frequently spent the night at his cottage, sleeping in the same bed with him, and it is said making use of His Excellency's nightshirts. Well, I was surprised when I saw that. Any modern observer would think that was strange. Of course, if you know much about 19th century history, you know that people of the same gender shared beds frequently. Sometimes I think when we describe this to our students or to the media or to the public, we understate it. It's not just necessity. It's not just the absence of beds or cold weather. It was a matter of commonly accepted friendly behavior, I think, for people to share beds. I try to explain it to my students this way. You can tell me if you find this persuasive. It's a cultural phenomenon. Just as today athletes share lockers and showers and nobody jumps to sexual suppositions, at least not everyone does. But in the 19th century, they would think that was incredibly bizarre. First of all, taking a shower, and second of all, taking a shower in a group, and they would be mystified by this in a way that we're mystified by them sharing beds. And so I do think the cultural context matters, and in this case it matters some, because Thomas Chamberlain, the officer in this regiment, reporting on this incident, is one voice. We have another voice, though, that Dr. Tripp, in his book about the intimate world of Lincoln, has used what he thinks is very persuasive effect. And this is a diary entry, and that's why it's so powerful. Not just a recollection of Lincoln and this bucktail captain. The soldiers were called the bucktails. But a diary entry from the time from a woman, Virginia Woodbury Fox, whose husband was in the Naval Department. And she writes that a friend had told her, quote, "There is a bucktail soldier here devoted to the president who drives with him and when Mrs. L is not home, sleeps with him." She explained in her diary after that, "What stuff?" And of course, what stuff is, a symbol to those who want to see in this relationship physical intimacy, a sign that there was gossip about this relationship. And I think it's fair to say there was gossip. This diary entry, coupled with the recollection, makes me believe there was some talk. But the question is, what was the talk about? I've already pointed out, I don't think the cultural context would lead them to jump into the conclusion it was a sexual relationship. The very opposite, in fact. When I read the Fox diary and I look at the recollection from Thomas Chamberlain, and I read some other bits and pieces from that period, what surprised and shocked everyone, including David Erickson himself, who writes about their relationship in a couple of different places, was that a president of the United States could break through class and social barriers and have a friendship with a captain, a country captain, Erickson calls himself, a bucktail soldier, Virginia Fox calls him. That's what mesmerized them, and yet I don't think it mesmerizes us, if we think about it that way, because the idea of Lincoln having a sense of fraternity with people regardless of their class or caste is an idea we're ready to accept, but they were still somewhat shocked by it, especially the Washington elite, which is where Fox is coming from here. And so when I put the story of the Erickson-Lincoln relationship into that context, it becomes, to me, an example of several friendships that he had during the Soldiers' Home period with men that were important to him and that reflect his commitment to fraternity. I could list dozens. Now, when I list them, they're friends. If Tripp would list them, they'd be gay lovers. And I think there you see where we have to divide on this evidence. But I'll give you an example. John Hay, a young man who would come to the Soldiers' Home and the president would read Shakespeare to him until Hay fell asleep. And then he'd spend the night when Mary Lincoln was away or when Mary Lincoln was there. Edwin Stanton. Now, Edwin Stanton is not anybody's idea of a lover. But there he is, time and again, with a cottage on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, because Stanton was a prolific bureaucrat and a very shrewd Washington insider, and he wanted access to the president. And very few people talk about the Stanton-Lincoln friendship, but they developed one at that Soldiers' Home. Partly because they were sharing cottages on the grounds of this place, partly because they both experienced the death of a young child during the war. There's a story, though, for me that captures it all here, which is from the Stanton sons. They recall that they had peacocks as pets when they were little boys in the summer of 1864. And to keep them from flying away, they tied blocks of wood to their feet, but there were trees on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home. And I guess during the course of the day, the peacocks and their blocks of wood got tangled up in the trees, and there was a little crisis. Well, just as the boys are confronting this problem, the president and Secretary of War Stanton arrive at the end of a long day, and they discover the Stanton boys distraught. And so, according to their recollection, the president climbed up into the tree and slowly worked to unwound the peacocks, and the Secretary of War stood and helped him, and they did it for a couple of hours. And, it's a silly little memory, but I think it's a poignant one, and it shows the President of the United States and the moments he had at the Soldiers' Home trying to capture some sense of normalcy. And there he is with Edwin Stanton becoming friendlier. There he is with John Hay. There he is with David Erickson. There he is with a host of other figures, reaching out, gaining sustenance from their friendship, and doing something, I think, that he was doing with his wife as well, which is the ultimate, I think, value of seeing his story in Washington through the lens of the Soldiers' Home. And this is where I think it's very important, and I don't know if I emphasize it enough in my book, but the more I've been thinking about it, the more value I see in it, and that's this. The Soldiers' Home was a sanctuary. If you know my book, you know that's the title I gave it. But it was also a bridge, and here's where it was a bridge. It was a bridge from Lincoln's world in Washington to his world in Springfield. The place in the Soldiers' Home, the cottage, was closer to the frame house on 8th and Jackson than anything like the White House would be. It was far more ordinary. It was still comfortable, but it wasn't that imposing place that the president's mansion was. It was also by creating a residence outside of the workplace, a 3-mile commute, it was also a way for the president to recall the glory of his circuit riding days. You know, the rhythm of that movement that so pleased him as he was a young professional and a middle-aged attorney who enjoyed riding the circuit and conversing with fellows and meeting people. He met wounded soldiers, he met runaway slaves, he met Washington locals. This is something that he benefited from by commuting. It's also something that invokes for him, I think, to a degree, at least hints at his early childhood in Indiana. You know, the soldier's home is a place on a shaded hill with lots of trees. It reminds him of his earlier days there. I do think it's true that by bringing Hay and Erickson and others into his house, he recreates what life was like for him a little bit in New Salem in the grocery store with Slicky Bill Green or with Joshua Speed in Springfield. And, you know, if you want to look at that evidence and see physical intimacy, no one can stop you because the evidence is gone. There's no Gap dress. There's no Ken Starr. But there's really no reason to believe it either. I think what you do see here at the end of the day is the President of the United States finding a way to achieve his public greatness by recreating the kind of private comfort that had helped him rise to power. And I do think that it is an incredibly important part of his presidency, the way he was able to bring Illinois into his life in Washington. And I see the Soldiers' Home as the vehicle for him to do it. So I wanted to lay that out for you today to think about. Some of you are experts in Washington. Maybe you also are experts in Springfield. But if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to take them, and maybe we can discuss its meaning. If you want to talk about Tripp's book, since it's been the most widely reviewed book on Lincoln since David Donald's biography, I'd be happy to talk about that too. And any other questions about the marriage as well, because I know there's several people in this room who are experts on the Lincoln marriage, perhaps in a way even that I'm not, and you might disagree with some of the conclusions I drew. So I'd be happy to hear comments or questions on that. Thank you.
Yes. In the course of your research, did you encounter any indication, or did you look at the assumption that Mary Lincoln may have been mentally ill? Specifically, in Jennifer's book, she talked about the broad mood swings of Mary Lincoln.
Right. Mental illness is tough to diagnose from this perspective. Robert Lincoln claimed that her mental capacity was different after the Carriage accident. I think a lot of scholars have demonstrated that she had a series of health problems, largely related to the problems she had with pregnancy and childbirth, that may have contributed to some of her irritability. I don't diagnose her, as an armchair, doctor. I don't diagnose her as having mental illness. But if there are people who do, I think the burden of proof is on them. Especially during this period, during the wartime period, she's a very effective political surrogate for the president. Several letters dated from the Soldiers' Home are political letters where she reaches out to his subordinates and associates. And I think he appreciated that in places. Now, we focus on where she was a liability. So easy. Remember the story about the renovations at the White House. Those flub dubs, he called them, that she wanted for the White House that created this problem for him. But, part of my argument about the transition in their marriage relates to that as well, because at the end of their stay at the Soldiers' Home, Mary Lincoln spent thousands of dollars to renovate a cottage there. And I don't think her husband objected to it. At least I can't find any evidence that he did. So I feel as if they came to some sort of mutual understanding by that point. And I don't see any evidence of illness in that kind of behavior. Irritability, difficulty, maybe selfishness, but not illness.
Yes.
Yes.
In terms, not that I think him sleeping with men affects the opinion of him as a president or anything like that, but dwelling on this sleeping together thing, was it a frequent issue? Because I know that strangers would sleep together, on travel, at toll houses and stuff, but was this a frequent occurrence or not with him?
Yeah, now this is also an interesting point you raised. You know, the old Seinfeld defense. Not that there's anything wrong with it, right? Is what people say when they talk about the question of whether men were sleeping with men. But it also, I think, it concedes too much. You know, I do think it would matter. If he was gay, I frankly think it would matter. Or if he was bisexual, I think it would have an impact on our understanding of him. I think that's self-evident. And to say otherwise is not persuasive to me. I think what I just tried to do today is show you how his relationships with men did matter, that fraternity was an important part of his sustenance, but I just don't think it was physical. Now, the question you're asking about how common this was is something we're developing in social history right now. And I think as Lincoln scholars, it's incumbent on us to try to get up to speed on this and learn about it. There are differing views. I portrayed it as relatively common, and I said, you know, it's not just a matter of necessity. There are some scholars who disagree with the way I just, you know, portrayed that. But I think I could defend myself on those grounds. But the point is, it is such an important part of their lives. I think we've been fools to ignore it for so long. And, you know, just like I think Dr. Tripp goes to one extreme, putting together evidence, you know, on the basis of wishful thinking on his part rather than on the basis of reading the context. I think for years, it's fair to say, some of us have, you know, ignored this or been indifferent to it for our own reasons, not because we were devoted to studying the period. And I think, at the very least, even with a bad book, he may have forced us to address a legitimate topic. So I'll concede that to him, even though I think the book is pretty bad.
I very much enjoyed your book. I've read it carefully. In one section, you mentioned 3 possible routes he took to get to Soldiers' Home.
Right.
But then you have a map which shows clearly the 7th Street route.
Right.
But the map is very difficult to read, and it sort of peters out at times, becomes foggy. I'm a Washingtonian. I happen to know that for years at the junction of Florida Avenue and North Capitol, there's a neat little road that goes off at an angle called Lincoln Road.
Mm-hmm.
And in the old days, before Soldiers' Home had all the hospitals on it, it was simply Soldiers' Home with a functioning dairy farm. But I think that road then led right into the Soldiers' Home. Did Lincoln ever, was it named for him? And we know that Florida Avenue used to be Boundary Street. It looks like North Capitol on the map you have doesn't even go beyond Florida Avenue. Could he have taken this thing, which became Lincoln Road and was called Lincoln Road? Are you aware of Lincoln's Road?
Yeah, no, I am. We checked maps from the period, and
Yes.
I didn't see any evidence of that road there, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there, because you know the quality of maps.
But on the map I'm referring to, it's the one little thing that juts off, whereas
Yeah.
North Capitol doesn't seem to continue.
I don't have a perfect answer for you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something I looked at. I tried to reach the best possible conclusion I had. It's so funny, you know. I spent all this time reading about the Soldiers' Home and finding all of these different bits and pieces. I couldn't figure out which bedroom he used. Couldn't figure out exactly which route he took each day. I'm sure he took different routes, but the 7th Street route is the one I think is the most likely, the most frequent. But there are so many little details that are almost impossible at this stage to recapture. It's so frustrating. And this business about Lincoln Road or the route that he took at the last stage of the trip is one that I was never able to fully resolve. So it's a good question, but I don't have a good answer. Who has the microphone?
Yeah, just a quick question to follow up on the routes to Soldiers' Home. Was these Carriage always escorted, unescorted, at times escorted, after the famous hat being shot off? And
Yeah. It's a great question, and something I wanted to talk about, but I decided to talk about the private life because of all of this news about the gay Lincoln. But I think some of the new insights from my book have as much to do with the security apparatus around the president and its impact on how we view the assassination as anything else. The truth is that he wasn't always escorted. The escorts began in the fall of '62. He was there from June of '62 on without escorts. Sometimes he dismissed the escorts. And during the course of the war, the escorts changed. He had a company from the New York Cavalry during the first 2 years that he was at the Soldiers' Home. And then in the last year of the war, he used a guard that was specially recruited from Ohio to escort him. He said about the New York escorts, by the way, he was in more danger from one of them firing accidentally than he was from Confederates. So there you go. And sometimes he rode on horseback, and sometimes he rode on carriage. Sometimes he rode with escorts, sometimes without. More often than not, toward the second half of the war, he rode with an escort. Yes? Oh, we'll start here. Right. It's a good question. I want to think about it. I will say this, you know, when we talk about the bad marriage, right, the marriage as a fountain of misery, there are a couple of landmark bits and pieces that people use, and one of them is that famous visit that Lincoln made to Grant's army, and then the outburst that Mary Lincoln had in 1865. My point here is just to remind everybody that there are other stories. You know, we have these landmark stories, the flub dubs, the visit to Grant's army in 65, but between those 2 points, you have all kinds of other stories that should be just as important in our interpretation of the marriage, but that have lost some space in the narrative. Maybe, you know, the success of the war makes Lincoln a more capable husband, able to spend more time with his wife. I think, though, the turning point is that summer of 63, when she had this crisis and he let her down and then realized he had let her down, and they came to this accommodation. You know, it's all really, I mean, it's rooted in a lot of speculation. I grant you that. But, you know, most of this has to be rooted in speculation. And in the last several years, we've been, I think, moving as a group, like cats, you know, but moving toward the view that the marriage was more misery than sustenance. And I'm not sure that's the right way to move. Yes.
I get to wear 3 hats today. One of them is as historian of the Illinois State Society, and I welcome you all. I'd invite you to take a copy of the green map on the table as you go for your lunch. Number 31 on the map is a soldier's home. There's a picture of the Anderson Cottage on the back. My question for you is, would you please speak about the pre-Anderson Cottage experience of the Lincolns?
Well, what do you mean by that?
Didn't they live in a different cottage before the Anderson Cottage?
Well, again, this is a great example of one of those bits and pieces that we debate about. The question is, on the grounds of the soldier's home, which cottage did they live in? I look at the evidence, and I think they lived, you call it the Anderson Cottage, I call it the Rigs Cottage. It was originally built by the banker Riggs. I think that's where they lived, but there's some confusion. The evidence is a little difficult to read, and there are plenty of people who believe that they lived at what we now call Quarters 1, where President Buchanan stayed in the 1850s, and then moved in the middle of the war to the Riggs Cottage. I think the weight of the evidence suggests that he lived in the same cottage on the grounds of this place. I'm not sure ultimately it matters that much other than in terms of the immediate preservation questions. It's like asking, you know, which cottage does the president stay at Camp David? The experience is still the important thing. But it's something I can't resolve for you with scientific certainty yet.
I want to appreciate your scholarship because I've studied Lincoln for 30 to 40 years. I live in Baltimore, and I remember 2 years walking around the cottage and saying to myself, my gosh, why didn't I ever know about this before? So, you know, why has the cottage been overlooked for so long? And now I understand it's on the National Register, and of course some restoration. And even in the time, what is the influence has it been on times since as far as other post-Civil War presidents?
And force people to incorporate it in the future. But, you know, these things come and go depending on how people prioritize the space in their books. In the immediate aftermath of the war, you would always find references to the soldier's home in various stories. And then by the middle of the 20th century, those references had tended to be written out. And now, there are very important stories that lots of scholars write about, like, for example, in August of '64, when the president discussed whether or not to abandon his emancipation pledge, when he met with Frederick Douglass and then he met with some conservatives from Wisconsin. That's always described as happening at the White House, but the meeting with the conservatives actually happened at the soldier's home. Meeting with Fernando Wood, a Copperhead Democrat, happened at the soldier's home. There are important meetings that took place at the soldier's home where the setting matters, but that, you know, it's been lost over time because in the accumulation of priorities in other places, people have almost forgotten until recently that the soldier's home existed. So even scholars, I think, had tended to forget it because of the way the trends had moved. One more question. Michael?
One of the problems I had in responding to the book was that you could easily explain that a frontier lawyer out on the circuit would share a bed with lots of other colleagues, and that was no big deal. But it was a little bit harder to dismiss a president of the United States sharing a bed. Even in the 19th century, surely a president could command his own sleeping quarters if he wanted to. So, but you alluded to something about men sharing beds going beyond necessity, and there being something else there that we need to explore that would clarify and explain it. Could you amplify that
When we
a little
study
bit?
same-gender friendships in the 19th century, they have a different intimacy than same-gender friendships do in the 20th century, and it's hard to convey. I try to do this in my class all the time, and it's difficult, especially with 18-year-olds, right, to get them to stop giggling and then to get them to listen to this. But, you know, women will write to women friends with a kind of romantic, almost, you know, sexually charged language that suggests to our ears a sexual relationship, lesbianism or bisexuality, but to their ears it's not so clear it would suggest that at all. Men will hold hands with men in photographs in the 19th century. It's not uncommon. And I think the point I was making is the right one. It's not just necessity that puts people in beds together. They view it as a kind of mark of friendship. And so I think what was gossiped about in Lincoln's case wasn't that he was sleeping with a man, but that, as Michael said, it's a president sleeping with a country captain. And it wasn't the sleeping that intrigued them. It was the idea that he had no sense of protocol or social etiquette. And I think those of us who know Lincoln understand it now. Like, that makes sense. That's the Lincoln we know, someone who ignores those kind of protocols. The physical intimacy, you know, it doesn't seem to fit with what I see in the story. And you know, it ultimately comes down to how you read the evidence. When Dr. Tripp reads a businesslike letter from Lincoln to one of his alleged gay lovers, he says, it's businesslike because they're hiding their true feelings. Dr. Tripp points out that Lincoln wrote yours forever in a letter to Joshua Speed, but he doesn't point out that Lincoln wrote yours forever to several other people. He calls David Erickson handsome, but he doesn't point out that we discussed this before he wrote his book. Erickson weighed a lot, and he was kind of short. And so, you know, Lincoln was 6'4", 185 pounds. Erickson was about 5'9", 220. They made an interesting pair. And I, you know, we debated this. Him and I talked about this on the phone as we were working on our respective books. And, you know, he excluded that from his work. I pointed out there's a story where Lincoln jokes about their relationship. And I think joking about the fact that he's tall and thin and Erickson's kind of short and stocky. And he says, we've grown quite thick together. Now, you know what Tripp would do with that line, and I look at it as just an example of how, if he was willing to joke about it so openly, it couldn't have had the kind of connotations that Tripp reads into it. So, I mean, ultimately, that's my answer. Okay. Well, thank you.